from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you, and here's today's lineup. K-State's Dan O'Brien talks about expected fieldwork delays brought on by wet fields as an increasing influence in the grain markets during his weekly segment on the grain price trends. Then K-State's Nathan Hendricks will talk about how renewable fuels policy has affected agricultural land use decisions in the U.S. His research shows that effect is actually less than previous research on the subject had indicated. This is but one part of a just-released study by multiple researchers of how the Renewable Fuel Standard has impacted the environment. And later, on Kansas agricultural weather, K-State's Mary Knapp. All that and more coming your way next on Agriculture Today.
Hamburgers, roast, ribs, steak, or whatever you prefer. Beef, it's what's for dinner. Kansas cattle farmers produce 7.5 million head of cattle per year. It takes about 7 tablespoons of peanut butter to get the same amount of protein in 1 serving of lean beef. Support your local Kansas farmers and ranchers. Eat beef. This message was brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
This is Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along with us once again. Well, first off, our look at the grain markets for this week, and standing by with his latest observations is Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, joining us from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Dan, because it's so evident, you look out the window wherever you are, virtually anywhere in the Central Plains and further beyond, field conditions are nowhere near anything that would be considered for field work. And that is starting to build itself up in the markets with planting issues looming.
Yes, even with concerns about getting fertilizer and herbicides down in all places of the Corn Belt, still we see December corn at $3.94, November beans at $9.32. Corn to bean price ratio that surprisingly actually has weakened a little bit from where it had been running for the last couple months. Again, not a lot. Had been 2.4, 2.45, something like that in terms of new crop November soybeans as a percent of new crop D19 corn. And now that's 237, weakening a little bit. So I think that's probably reflective of, again, the ideas that the moisture here that we've been receiving will likely have some impact. And again, we're just the very beginning stages of, by what we see in the futures, of even starting to see anything of that concern being reflected at all. In fact, if you read from the, look at the CFTC data of analysts that look at that closely, if anything, we've had pretty strong short sell bearish positions amongst the managed money traders in those markets. So we have kind of a collision of ongoing overall pessimism about where prices would go this year. Some of that fed by waiting to see what would happen between U.S. and China and relatively good crops in South America, it turns out. And so you have the pessimism on the part of the futures traders and these realities in the field that, gosh, we're not going to be able to get into the field right for weeks and weeks. And as we sit here in literally mid-March, forecast in much of the Corn Belts for some drying after this storm system moves out in the next 10 days, they'll be certainly welcome by U.S. farmers from Kansas to Ohio and from Minnesota to the southeast. But we're looking for drying weather to occur in April and May, and that's not normally when we have drying weather. So we're, I was going to say setting up for, that's too strong of a market-influencing term, but we're having to objectively look at the possibilities of whether we'll have dry enough conditions over the next 30 to 45 days to allow us to have appreciably begin planting the U.S. corn crop across in different areas of the nation, much less other crops that follow just closely behind. So
right.
It's a quote deal, Eric, that we'll have to that the market will have to wrestle with, and it doesn't look like when you see, again, D's corn at $3.94 and November beans at $9.32, it doesn't look like there's a lot of worry in those markets yet.
We're not to that threshold yet, but you've put together some what-ifs, and we talk every spring about, to put it this way, the acreage waltz between corn and soybeans and who's in the lead. Well, if in fact corn, and for that matter other spring-planted crops like spring wheat, end up acreage being sown to soybeans instead, well, that's going to be a market mover.
Yeah, I think when we look at what the USDA has projected so far, this came out of their February 22nd Ag Outlook Conference, they were, as they needed to be, they were pretty conservative with regard to where they thought acreage would go. Whereas best estimate of the National Ag Statistics Service, it was that we had 89.1 million acres of corn planted here in 2018. Their projection was that number would go higher by about 3 million bushels, up to about 92 million. And for soybeans, whereas we had just about the same, just a little bit higher, marginally higher amount of acreage of soybeans planted, about 89.14, they're projecting that number would move lower down to 85 million acres. Well, if we have a persistence of wet conditions, well, the first thing that's affected would be corn acreage. We don't want to just do wild guesses. So if you look at a scenario where, we have, say we instead of that 92 million acres, we have enough delays on, say, 4 or 5% of our cropland, and that's not hard to imagine at all right now. Some of that's with all the flooding and extreme saturation that we have. You could see, instead of 92 million acres, more like 88 million acres of corn planted. And for those acres that aren't planted, they're pushed in much of the Corn Belt to the next best alternative crop for financial purposes, and that would be soybeans. At least in the eastern Corn Belt. Here in Kansas, we have shorter season corn varieties, we have grain sorghum we can consider, and a number of other things. But in much of the Corn Belt to the east, they can also plant sorghum back there, but a lot of them will probably consider soybeans. So instead of that 85 million acre number planted in 2019, if that number moves upwards to, say, 87.5, up about 2.5 million, with that difference going to wherever it would go with other crops, then you're looking at some impact on the USDA scenarios. It makes all the difference, I think, if we have 88 million acres of corn instead of 92, and if we have good yields but not unbelievable yields, that's the difference between $3.65 corn, like the USDA is projected, and $4 corn, literally. Again, you're looking at about 600 or 700 million bushels, and given our demand being pretty consistent, that makes a difference in prices. And for the soybean side, if you push acreage out the back door of the planting window and crop insurance season off into soybeans, as we get off into May, June, you end up with, instead of 85 million acres, about 87.5 production at this just under 50 bushels per acre, about 49.5. You're looking at, instead of 4.175, you're something about 4.3 billion bushels, and total price impact probably of about 25, 30, 40 cents lower on soybeans, just with that many more bushels on the market. So, at this time of year, when you look at these impacts, you're pretty cautious, really, and in trying to not just project a tremendous extreme outcome. So here we shave acreage a little bit, you shave production some, you look at historic relationships in terms of prices for U.S. soybeans and U.S. corn, and say 40 cents either way. But if you add in other factors that the market becomes worried based on whatever else could happen around the globe, then those price responses and those acreage moves could be lower or higher, but they could be more than what we're talking about here. These seem to be, I think, good estimates, guesses, based on average response to prices, to supply-demand conditions over time in terms of how prices change.
Well, planting prospects will, in all likelihood, remain a headliner, and increasingly so as we move on into the springtime. Dan, quickly, if you would, pass along your latest observations on basis levels at our Kansas trading points, at the elevators and the like.
Well, when you look at our demand centers for feed grains, we look to Southwest Kansas, and for Southwest Kansas corn and grain sorghum for corn, we have decent basis levels. I don't see any positive numbers there. If anything, a lot of times we'll see 5, 10, 15 cents over. Well, we're looking at some of the best basis bids being 5 under to 10 under, and in some areas dropping off to 40 cents under in western Kansas. That's indicative of not a lot of worries about corn supplies, at least at this time. When you look at corn in the eastern part of the state, though, you do see the Atchison-Topeka bids being positive, the Hutchinson bid being about 15 under for corn. For grain sorghum, you do see the Topeka bid at about 5 under. That would be the May contract. So that stands out as a pretty positive bid. Salina at 40 under and Wellington at 40 under as well. So some move towards export business probably being reflected there, and you hear rumor of that in the market, that China, other players may have entered in and bought some grain sorghum, may have bought some corn. We'll see, but when you start to see, again, 1 or 2 locations moving more, you do wonder about some export shipments being lined up. When you look at soybeans, of course, we've been struggling with soybean basis here in Kansas and, frankly, around the U.S. for a number of months. Some pretty notable markets, Salina, Hutchinson, Wichita, all about $1 under. That's in central Kansas and western Kansas. Take that $1 under and add about 30 to 40 cents to it, if not a little bit more. For wheat basis bids, there's a variety. Actually, you do see a terminal bid in the Topeka area, again, of 5 over. A lot of other bids about 10, 15 under. So we've certainly had worse basis bids for wheat in central Kansas than that over time. So that's indicative of not too terrible of a basis local demand situation. Out to the west, for hard red winter wheat, you're looking at 30 to 55 under basis bids, not too far from where we typically see historic averages. So we would really do well to see other areas of the world dry up for their export supplies and have other countries come to the U.S. en masse. And that just hasn't happened yet. And once it does, if it does, that's when I think we'd see the wheat export numbers and wheat basis bids start to reflect something much more positive for Kansas wheat producers.
And a good weekend to you as always, Dan. Thanks for contributing these thoughts.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Dan O'Brien, grain market economist for K-State Research and Extension, is along with us each Friday to talk grain price trends here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
Agriculture Today continues now on the K-State Radio Network. And now, a closer look at a new study that was made public this week. A trio of researchers, including one here at Kansas State University, put out information that they've been working on in recent months on the environmental implications of federal renewable fuels policy. We're welcoming in Nathan Hendricks. He is an agricultural economist. This has become a catalyst for quite some discussion, to put it that way, Nathan, over the past several days. And our purpose here is to clarify what this study is actually saying about renewable fuels policy here in this country. Just let us know what the genesis of this study was. What launched it?
Yeah, so I got contacted by researchers at University of Wisconsin who are in the geography department up there, and they have been studying land use changes. And so they contacted me, seeing some of my previous research, and they said, well, we want some economic analysis put into this. If we want to do understanding environmental impacts of renewable fuel standard, we want to be able to incorporate economics. So they reached out to me, as well as an economist at University of California, Davis, to provide that economic analysis into insights into the study. It was funded by National Wildlife Federation, and one of the things when I first went onto the project is I said, are you okay with whatever the answer is? And they said, yes, you come up with what you think the right number is, and you put together the best science and So then I was willing to go forward and work on the project.
And just to note, you've been here on the broadcast before. You have quite a track record in agricultural resource economic analyses. That's why they asked you to be part of this. The research was broken down into three components. Beyond the land use side you looked at, you might briefly allude to the other two.
Yeah, so a researcher at University of California, Davis, he was involved in estimating how the Renewable Fuel Standard impacts crop prices. That was his primary role. My role in the project was then to study how changes in crop prices impact land use. And then collaborators at Wisconsin were responsible for then saying what the environmental impacts of those land use changes were.
Well, let's concentrate on what you worked on. Basically explain how you quantified the impact of, well, in particular, the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is at the core of federal renewable fuel policy, on land use. How do you get at that?
Yeah, so the way we're going to look at that is we're going to think about this in terms of economics of that. The Renewable Fuel Standard causes a shift in demand for corn. That's going to increase the price of corn, which will then have some spillovers into other markets as well. And then those changes in prices have impacts on land use. So that's the way we're going to quantify that, is say how does land use respond to prices, and how do prices respond to the Renewable Fuel Standard. So again, my part was to look at how prices impact land use. And so there's two main portions that I'm looking at here: changes in corn on existing cropland and changes in total cropland area. And it's important. What I don't want to do is just compare before and after the Renewable Fuel Standard, because there's a lot of other things that changed. So instead, what I want to do is estimate how prices impact what's being planted. And so the first part is to look at how much corn was planted on existing cropland. For that, I used field-level data from 2004 to 2016. The crop type is classified from remote sensing data. This is put out by USDA. It's what they call the cropland data layer, publicly available data set. And so then we end up with 3.6 million fields over this time period, accounting for 91.6% of all corn acreage in the nation. And then once we observe those cropping patterns at the field, we can estimate how did farmers change their crop rotations as prices change. And we estimate different models across different regions of the United States to account for the fact that the response to price differs by where you're at, and there's a lot of other different factors across the United States. So we're estimating a lot of different models to account for all the differences across the nation. The second part, again, was to estimate how prices impact total cropland area. And here the data source we're using is the National Resources Inventory data from USDA. NRCS at USDA, they take a sample of points across the nation and they manually code at each of those points what the land use was at different points in time. So you can observe the points over time, and you can see if they've transitioned from cropland to CRP or from CRP to cropland and so forth. And they actually have the data on whether or not that point was actually CRP from federal program data as well. From that, I'm estimating models of how the transitions between cropland and pasture. And so those transitions, whether farmers are going from cropland to pasture or from pasture to cropland, are going to depend on the returns to crop production and will depend on the returns to pasture as well. And so estimate how those transitions depend on returns. And then also estimate the transitions between cropland and CRP. Those transitions of either going cropland to CRP or CRP to cropland depend, again, on the returns to crop production, on the CRP rental rate in that county that was offered in that particular year, and also the CRP contractual arrangements. So farmers can only exit CRP when their contract is expiring, and the National Resources Inventory has some information in there to tell us when that contract is likely expiring. And then also they can only enroll in CRP when there's a sign-up offered, and so we account for that of only modeling the transitions those times. And what happens there is when you have higher prices, then that's going to have an incentive to bring more land into crop production, and also is going to reduce the incentive to enroll land into CRP. And so quantifying those impacts.
Obviously, as one can hear, corn price is a pivotal variable in all of this. And again, your colleague at UC Davis worked on the price angle, but the prices used here, how do they compare with what the corn and ethanol sectors are saying about corn price trends?
Yeah, I think we're pretty similar in what we're saying. So the results we're using, Aaron Smith at UC Davis put this out of corn prices increased by 30%. That's out of a published article that he has. Then also the Renewable Fuels Association cited an article a year and a half ago that also indicated corn prices. In that study, they indicated corn prices increased about 34%.
And the indication is clear that there is an inherent impact of renewable fuels policy, in the absence of which corn prices would be lower still. Right?
Yeah, that's right. So to say that corn prices today would be lower without the Renewable Fuel Standard, I would agree that is true, and that's really the same thing as saying that corn prices are higher because of the Renewable Fuel Standard.
Well, what's interesting on the land use side of it that you concentrated on, Nathan, is that there's been another previous study along a similar line out of two other universities, University of Illinois, Auburn University. How do your results compare to those estimates?
Yeah, well, ironically, I would find smaller impacts of the Renewable Fuel Standard on both corn acreage and total cropland. So in other words, if you're using my estimates, the environmental impact of the Renewable Fuel Standard is smaller than what you would indicate from this other study. So, for example, my results show that the Renewable Fuel Standard has increased corn acreage in the United States by 6.9 million acres annually. And there's been an increase in total cropland area by 2.8 million acres between 2009 and 2016. If you go back to this other study by researchers in Auburn and Illinois, when you look at those results, they're also looking at what's the impact on acreage of being close to an ethanol plant and what's the impact of changes in crop prices. And if you dig into their results, when they evaluate the change in crop prices, they're looking at what was the observed change in crop prices, not what was the change in prices due to the Renewable Fuel Standard. So I've gone back to their estimates and I say, okay, well, we probably only have about a 30% increase in corn price due to the Renewable Fuel Standard, so probably not all of the increase in acreage due to crop prices was due to the Renewable Fuel Standard. So if I scale down their numbers, so I say, okay, let's assume only 30% of the estimate of what they say is actually due to the Renewable Fuel Standard, then my estimates of the change in corn acreage due to the Renewable Fuel Standard are about 34% smaller than their study, and my estimates of the change in total cropland acreage due to the Renewable Fuel Standard are about 69% smaller. And if I don't scale down their estimates, if I just use the raw estimates out of their study, then they would have indicated total cropland acreage increased by at least 13.8 million acres compared to my estimate of an increase of 2.8 million acres. So again, if you're comparing those studies, the environmental impacts using my estimates would be much smaller than if you use their estimates.
As you look at the Renewable Fuel Standard and basically renewable fuels policy here, there is a change in land use, and you've quantified that here. Nathan, I want to ask you what this study in total suggests about the RFS moving forward. We'll take that up after the break. Our guest is K-State agricultural economist Nathan Hendricks, one of the co-authors of this new study on environmental implications of renewable fuel policy. He'll return with us in a few moments here on Agriculture Today.
While many people know hunger is an issue in developing countries, it is also a problem in our own backyards. In 2010, 1 in 7 Kansans struggled to put adequate food on the table. 2 K-State research and extension programs are tackling this problem. The Family Nutrition Program and Expanded Food and Nutrition Education Program reach thousands of Kansans in more than 70 counties. They learn how to eat healthy with a low budget. For more information about these programs, visit ksre.ksu.edu.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And continuing on for a few moments here, our conversation with K-State agricultural economist Nathan Hendricks. Again, Nathan was among those who have recently posted a new study of the Renewable Fuel Standard as part of federal renewable fuel policy in this country and the ensuing impact of that standard on the environment. Now, to reiterate, Nathan was invited as part of this study to identify how increases in corn prices, as quantified by another of his co-authors, would influence land use changes. And just to summarize, his results indicated an increase in corn acreage of 6.9 million acres annually and an increase in total cropland area by 2.8 million acres over the period 2009 to 2016. That was the scope of the study. So again, Nathan, through your findings, you indicate that the Renewable Fuel Standard has changed land use. But by the same token, you wanted to stress that the standard has rendered benefits to agricultural producers.
Yes, for sure. This has had positive impacts for farmers. So that increase in corn price that we've quantified, I would argue that has definitely led to short-run increases in net farm income and long-run increases in land values for farmers. And again, and I would have other research that would inform those kinds of estimates, but that was really beyond the scope of this particular study.
So, Nathan, and again, stepping back, the study is quite involved, and we haven't covered everything in it by any means today, but what do you hope, as we look at the study in its entirety, the message would be conveyed to agricultural producers, to policymakers, any others that would be interested in this topic? What do you hope comes of this?
Yeah, I just hope to have the most reliable estimate out there that incorporates sound economic analysis to understand these impacts. Again, there's a lot of studies that quantify things out there, and I think it's important to have a number that's based on sound economic analysis. And so that's when I go to the research. I don't come with a particular what I think the number needs to be, but instead I'm going to let the data and the best analysis possible drive to the answer. And so I'm not making any policy recommendations out of this. We just want to quantify the impact in the most reliable way possible.
It's a notable piece of research that you and your associates at California Davis and Wisconsin have put together, and we appreciate you coming over, Nathan, and lining out what your part of the study says definitively here in understanding the impact of renewable fuels policy on land use changes. We appreciate your time. Thanks for coming over.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Nathan Hendricks with us, agricultural economist at Kansas State University. Once again, he co-authored this scientific look at federal renewable fuel policy and its environmental repercussions, acknowledging here that when the results of this overall study were made public earlier this week, there was abrupt reaction in some corn and renewable fuel production sectors, concerns expressed there about the perceived negative connotations of the findings for the Renewable Fuel Standard. The interim dean of agriculture here at Kansas State University, Ernie Minton, offers these observations on those concerns and the objectives of this research.
As a research-oriented institution, K-State, of course, is obviously the land-grant university in the state of Kansas, and part of our mission, in addition to extension and teaching, is research. And we approach research in the way that any research university does. We tackle problems and very carefully design and control studies. In the case of economic studies, there are certain assumptions, that have to be made, but those assumptions are laid out and conditions are described. And I think that's clearly what Nathan has in his research as well. And then when the results come in, we look at those results, our economists and other scientists do, and we have to interpret them, and then we deal with what those data actually say. And I think that's the case here. This would be the kind of thing that we do routinely. At Cattleman's Day, for example, I think Glenn Tonser talked about non-meat protein sources, and that's another example of a situation where we have to, evaluate things that are not necessarily part of the mainstream, and see what the data say. And again, as the land-grant university, certainly value our relationship with livestock and commodity groups, and when these kinds of things are reported and they cause a stir, cause a elevated amount of conversation and traffic, then we end up, needing to deal with that. But importantly, we need to ask the question. We ask the questions, and then we look at the results and deal with them in a very professional way.
Comments there from K-State Interim Dean of Agriculture, Ernie Minton. You're listening to Agriculture Today. Now this week's edition of the Kansas Wheat Scoop. Here's Marcia Boswell.
Kansas Governor Laura Kelly has designated March as Kansas Agriculture Month, since agriculture is Kansas's largest industry, employer, and economic driver. This month is all about recognizing the hard-working men and women in the agriculture industry, as well as raising awareness that crops and animals raised on Kansas farms are providing healthy food to not only Kansas families, but to families around the world. Dillon's Food Stores and the Kansas Agricultural Organizations have partnered up with Harvesters, the Community Food Network, Second Harvest Community Food Bank, and Kansas Food Bank to ensure that the Neighbor to Neighbor food drive reaches every community in Kansas. The food drive will run until the end of March, and anyone can participate. Many youth organizations, such as 4-H, have been challenged to host their own food drives. The state has been divided into 4 regions, and one group from each region will receive an award for collecting the most needed items. The winning group will receive a $1,500 voucher to purchase groceries at a Dillon's food store to donate to their local food bank. All the donations that are made at your local Dillon's food store will be redistributed throughout your community. You can request a barrel from a Feeding America food bank that is within your region. Donations to the Neighbor to Neighbor food drive can also be made at any Dillon's food store location, and they will match donations made at the register. If you want to put together your own food drive, visit the website www.agriculture.ks.gov/KSAgDay. You will learn about the resources needed to start your own food drive, put together an Ag Day event in your community, and discover classroom resources from partnering ag organizations. For Kansas Wheat, I'm Marcia Boswell.
Thanks, Marcia, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Legal and financial concerns surround the day-to-day management of the agricultural industry. Producers, ag creditors, and USDA agencies rely on Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. If you've received an adverse decision from the USDA or have an ag credit concern, call today 800-321-3276 or visit us online, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services, exploring options, generating solutions. Up for you now on Agriculture Today, our weekly look at Kansas agricultural weather. And alongside, as always, is Research and Extension climatologist at K-State, Mary Knapp. Mary, first, the standout weather feature this past week undoubtedly was what they were calling the bomb cyclone. Now, the state of Kansas missed the brunt of that. Our friends to the north and west in Colorado and Nebraska, not so fortunate. Define for us what a bomb cyclone is, because it's, as you say, more than just a creation of social media. It is steeped in climatological lore.
Right. The term was actually coined back in the 50s, and it actually is called bomb genesis. And what happens, it's a very precise meteorological term defining a rapid drop in pressure. And basically you have to drop 24 millibars in 24 hours, which is a very, very rapid change in pressure. Out in Colorado, they are looking at a record low barometric pressure for the state. Kansas, we came within a couple of tenths of a millibar of setting our own state record for low pressure. And in fact, as we go and look at the archival records, we might actually determine that it is a new state record. But that takes a lot of research to verify that we've gotten the lowest pressure. And it should be noted that when we talk about these record pressures, we're talking about it outside of a tornado, because in a tornado you could easily have pressures that are lower than that. But with that, it's a very narrow area in a very short time period. So getting back to our bomb cyclone, when you have that very rapid drop in pressure, you also have a very strong gradient in pressure from the core of that low to the edges. And as everyone knows, when you have those strong pressure gradients, you get the strong winds. And that was really a major part of the problem with this particular storm. Winds in excess of 50 miles an hour were seen in Kansas. As you got into the Rockies and into the eastern plains of Colorado, they were recording wind speeds in the 90s. Colorado Springs Airport may set their all-time record for wind gusts, and similarly, they've got a very strong wind that was recorded at Denver International Airport. We'll have more details on this storm. If people are interested, they can look at the Agronomy E update, where we've put a synopsis of the winds and precipitation that was recorded in Kansas and a little bit to our west. Nebraska is still enduring it as this system is very slow to move out. Part of the problem is there was a warm front on the one side and the cold front on the other. A lot of snow on the ground in eastern Nebraska and western Iowa, in fact, most of Iowa, melted very rapidly. The ground underneath is still frozen. As we mentioned last week, that brings in flooding concerns, and of course that flooding has been realized in those two states. And in fact, we've got flooding in Kansas. We did not have quite as dense a snowpack, so we're not having as deep of flooding, but there are still issues across the state from western Kansas all the way to Donovan County, and that problem isn't going to be alleviated overnight. We still have frozen soils. We're looking forward to the chance of some milder weather as we go through the weekend into next week and hopefully start thawing that soil out.
But for the record, it's been considerably cooler than normal March for Kansas, as the numbers tell us.
As the numbers tell us, yes, it has. When we look at last week's numbers, and we did have some warm weather in last week, we were still running almost 8 degrees cooler than normal statewide. The southwest and the south central were on the warm side, but they were still 5 degrees cooler than average for this time of the year. And yesterday's weather did not change that much to the positive side. If we look at the year-to-date, we're still looking at, here in Manhattan, we're 6 degrees cooler than normal. So a lot of the state follows a similar trend. So it's been a very, very cold start to the year and a very wet one.
And again, the numbers for this past week on moisture, what kind of totals were we looking at there?
Well, last week, believe it or not, was actually dry because we didn't really get into the moisture until Tuesday and Wednesday. So we'll have those numbers as we do the summary next week. Mm-hmm. But with that, we were looking at like 1.5, 2 times our normal rainfall just in the Tuesday, Wednesday storm events. And in fact, some places saw their entire monthly total in that 2-day time period.
Well, let's accentuate the positive here, as you say, rolling into this weekend, carrying through the better part of next week, warmer conditions than what we've been experiencing, and sunny days.
Well, at this point, there is a chance that a system will roll through Tuesday and Wednesday that may spark a few showers and may even see a few snowflakes with it. But the overall outlook is for drier than normal conditions for the week and warmer than normal. And of course, that combination is exactly what we need to start preparing the soils for planting season, which is rapidly approaching. As we look into the 8 to 14 day, which carries us through the end of March, it does favor warmer than normal pattern, but it is looking to be wetter than normal as well, so we may have a wet end to March. The April outlook has not yet been released, so that will be something that we'll revisit next week. But the 3 to 4 week outlook is not encouraging in that it is calling for cooler than normal temperatures. On the moisture side, it's neutral. It's equally likely to be wet or dry. So we'll have to see how that develops as they run the additional models.
But at the very least, we may have finally turned that long-awaited corner into actual spring weather, Mary.
Well, and keep in mind that we are still a week out from spring.
Technically
5 days, spring doesn't officially arrive until March 20th, and we can hope that when it actually arrives that we can enjoy some more spring-like weather without the complications of the severe storms that have plagued our neighbors to the south and to the east.
As always, we appreciate you stopping over. Many thanks.
Thanks, Eric.
Climatologist Mary Knapp, K-State Research and Extension with us, and we thank you as well for tuning in. Please rejoin us this same time right here on Monday, won't you? Until then, a good weekend to you. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.